My lesson this week is focused on desegregation and magnet schools. So I'm going to start with just some background information about the sort of historical timeline of desegregation in America. Some of this might sound familiar because John gave a similar lesson a few weeks ago, but I'm going to actually start before Brown versus Board of Ed. I'm going to kind of talk about some of the cases that led up to Brown versus Board of Ed. So I'm going to actually start with Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a court case in 1896 in Louisiana, and the background here was that this man named Homer Plessy was a civil rights activist, and he appeared white, but he was technically black by Louisiana standards. He was 1/8 black, 7/8 white, and he was part of a civil rights group that wanted to challenge some of the racist Jim Crow laws. So they kind of staged his arrest in a way. Basically, they bought him a train ticket on a whites-only train, and because they didn't think like the conductor would arrest him, they actually brought a private investigator along who could legally arrest people. And basically, as soon as the conductor came by, Plessy told the conductor, by the way, I'm black and I'm sitting in a white train, and the private investigator arrested Plessy and took him to court. The judge's name was Ferguson, so that's when we get Plessy versus Ferguson. So initially, Plessy was found in violation of the law, which was expected. I mean, that's what they planned. He was arrested for being a black man in a white train car, and he was fined $25 and set free. But he refused to pay, and he challenged the law and brought it to the Louisiana Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Ferguson, the judge. And this went on to the Supreme Court, which also ruled in favor of Ferguson, the judge, and it ruled that the law that allowed separate train cars for black and white passengers didn't violate the Constitution. So that's what set this precedent of separate but equal. Supreme Court opinion stated, "We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this is so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it." So this is basically saying you can have enforced separation, and if one group, it says here, if the colored group thinks that they're being stamped with a badge of inferiority, it's only because they choose to put that label upon themselves. So again, this set up the legal precedent for separate facilities, white and colored water fountains, schools, buses, that sort of thing. The next case I want to talk about is called Cumming v. Richmond County Board of Education in 1899. Now this one was a lot less well known, and I kind of stumbled upon it. I don't remember learning about this in school. But basically what happened in this case was this county in Georgia had 3 high schools. It had a black high school and 2 white high schools, and it didn't have enough money, so it had to close the school, and it closed the black high school, kept the 2 white high schools open. And this was very odd because the county itself was predominantly black. So it had 2 white high schools for the white minority that was supplied with taxpayer dollars from a mostly black district. So a group of black parents, they refused to pay the tax, and they sued the town, saying basically if the town can't afford a black school, then they shouldn't have a white school either. This reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the district, basically saying how a district chooses to spend its money is entirely up to that. So it's a states' right issue. The only way we could step in as a Supreme Court is if there's evidence of, quote, hostility to the colored race, unquote. So basically, the burden of proof is on parents to find evidence of hostility against colored people. Otherwise, a state can do whatever it wants with its money, which led to a lot of these southern districts not having any schools for black people. The black students just didn't go to school. The next major case in this timeline is from a man named Lloyd Gaines. A case called Missouri XREL Gaines v. Canada. So Lloyd Gaines was a prospective law student in Missouri. He was a very bright student, great law school candidate, and he applied to University of Missouri Law School, but he was denied entry by the registrar, whose last name was Canada, because he was black. And the state of the state of Missouri actually offered to pay his tuition to go to an out-of-state school if he chose, because they didn't want him going to their school. And he refused. He said, "No, I'm going to school here, and I'm going to take you to court to allow myself to go here." And this was the first time that the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the black plaintiff. So basically, the Supreme Court said that if a district offers a school for white students, it has to offer another school for black students. And if it can't afford both or chooses not to, then it has to integrate that school. So this was the first time that that black students couldn't be denied education. This case was very important because it sort of set the legal path towards Brown versus Board of Ed. It didn't outlaw segregation, but it did say you can't deny black students education. I should say, before we get to Brown versus Board of Ed, this map shows that education was primarily a state right at the time. The red states, you can see, required educational segregation prior to Brown versus Board of Ed. The green states forbade it. So basically, in most of these northern states, you couldn't segregate schools. So this was very much a states' rights issue. So the major case in desegregation law was Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954. This young student on the right is Lydia Brown, and her story is that she had to walk 6 blocks to get on a bus, which took her a mile down the road to get to her black school, when she lived just 7 blocks or walking distance from a white school. Brown was certainly not the only case. There had been a lot of other cases that basically said the same thing, challenging segregation. And it was the NAACP that kind of provided legal counsel to the sort of the best cases, like the ones that had the best shot at challenging segregation. So there were actually 5 cases, Brown versus Board of Ed being one of them, that went to the Supreme Court all in one big bundle. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was a violation of the 14th Amendment. So it basically overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and it said schools have to be integrated. And what's unique about this is it seemed initially, like after the first round of debate by the court, that it was going to pass. The Brown versus Education would pass, and that it would overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, but it didn't seem like it would be a unanimous decision. It probably would have been like 6-3 or 5-4. And the Supreme Court justices thought that they knew that this would be a historically significant decision, and they thought this has to be done unanimously. If there's any doubt, people just aren't going to do it. So they actually stalled by demanding more debate while they were able to convince the few remaining colleagues to get on the sort of right side of history. So, after a couple of rounds of debate, it was a unanimous decision in 1954 to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson, and this ended school segregation. Even though Brown v. Board of Ed passed Supreme Court unanimously, it wasn't well received by the southern states, and the politicians in those states did everything they could to stop it. And those politicians had the support of their voters and constituents. You see a lot of these photos of protests, stop mixing the race mixing is communism. Some notable examples of politicians trying to stop the Brown versus Board of Ed include Virginia Senator Harry S. Byrd, who within a couple weeks after the Supreme Court decision, he implemented something called the Massive Resistance, which was a series of legislative maneuvers to legally stop integration. A lot of these maneuvers, they were pretty obviously going to be shut down by the federal court, but that kind of thing takes years. So this was basically a stall tactic. Some of the things that Senator Byrd did was he passed a law in Virginia where any school that integrated was ineligible to receive state funds. Any school that integrated could be immediately shut down by the governor. So basically, the schools just couldn't afford to follow the law. So these schools that got shut down, that money was then funneled into private schools, white-only private schools, which didn't have to follow the law. And the senators set up these committees called pupil placement boards, where they took they looked at any student that wanted to attend school in Virginia and decided which school to send them to. And lo and behold, all the white students got sent to these private schools funded by the money that used to go to the public schools. Again, completely illegal, and they knew it, but it took years for the Justice Department to fight it in court. So these were basically stall tactics that worked. Another example of a politician fighting this was Strom Thurmond. He was the initial author of something called the Southern Manifesto, which was a document signed by almost every senator and congressman from the southern states. It was something like 99 out of 110, something like that. And what the Southern Manifesto basically said was, it said that this Brown versus Board of Education was clearly overreaching in terms of judicial power. It said it's completely stepping all over the 10th Amendment, which is the States' Rights Amendment. And basically said we're going to stick together. We're going to do everything we can to stop this. This is a picture of what was known as the Little Rock 9. So these are 9 students in Little Rock, Arkansas, that the NAACP chose to be the first students to integrate at Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. These students were selected because they were the best of the best, perfect attendance, perfect grades, and the NAACP knew that if it wanted to start sending black students into these historically white schools, they needed to start with the best ones. This is Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus, this guy right here speaking. He stood outside Central High School in Little Rock, and he said, no, we're not letting these students in. And his justification was, I represent my constituents who oppose this, and for the sake of public safety, and even for the safety of these 9 black students, I refuse to let them in because we could have a riot on our hands. He's surrounded by police officers and the Arkansas National Guard. And in response to this, President Eisenhower, he called the army in. The 101st Airborne. So he sent the Army in, and he also federalized the National Guard in Arkansas, which basically said he took the power of the National Guard from the governor and basically said, this National Guard works for me now. And that's why we see these iconic photos of the Little Rock Nine being escorted by Army soldiers. This was one of the photos that John showed us. I think he had a different one where they were on the staircase. But this was in Little Rock, and this was to protect these students. Another example of a politician trying to stop segregation was Alabama Governor George Wallace. He was featured in Forrest Gump, you might remember, and he was actually assassinated in 1970. But he was elected governor in 1962, so this was 6 years after Brown versus Board of Ed. And I found a sound clip of his inaugural address, which basically summarizes what he's all about.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
So in case that audio didn't come across, this was his famous quote: "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw a line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." He basically won in a landslide. Again, the popular support was for segregation at the time. This was Governor Wallace standing outside the door of the University of Alabama, where 2 black students were admitted to the college, but he said, no, I'm not letting these students in. What you see here is the Attorney General of the United States confronting him, and I actually have a little clip of this. This clip is 12 minutes long. I'm only going to show a few seconds of it. So basically what's going on is President Kennedy, because remember this was like 6 years after, President Kennedy sent his Attorney General to confront Governor Wallace. Governor Wallace, he refused to move, and he made like a 7 or 8 minute political speech on states' rights. The Attorney General then called the President, told him that the governor wasn't moving, and the Attorney General, JFK, President, federalized the Alabama National Guard. So basically he took the power away from the governor. And this clip, let's see if I can pull up the ending, features a very famous clip of the General of the National Guard. I think it's coming up here. There he is. This is the General of the Alabama National Guard who used to work for the governor. The governor's power was taken away, and he now works for the president.
Followed by United States Attorney Major Weaver. That's the general walking up the doorway of Foster Auditorium. And Governor Wallace walks out to meet him, and here's the way it went. General Graham, and it's my sad duty to ask you to step aside under the orders of the President of the United States. As a member of the Alabama National Guard, I've been ordered into the federal service this morning because of the injustice. It is my duty to ask you to step aside in order that the orders of the court may be accomplished.
It's a little tough to hear, but basically he said it's my sad duty to tell you, or to order you to step aside. Which he did. It was just a giant publicity stunt. But again, these were all tactics that these politicians knew wouldn't hold up in court. They were just stall tactics, and they managed to keep these schools relatively segregated for a good 4, 5, 6 years. So as these political loopholes started being closed by the government, the question then turned to how do we physically go about integrating these schools? And the main way that districts tried this was with mandatory busing programs, which I'll talk about briefly. Busing really picked up in the 70s. In 1971, busing was an issue brought up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that busing is a perfectly legitimate way, doesn't violate any constitutional rights of anyone. And after that, a lot of districts started busing students. And what busing basically did was it took students from their neighborhood and bused them into another area to force integration. And it was opposed by both sides. White and black students were extremely opposed to busing. It had something like 4% approval from white families and 9% approval from black families. The main reason for this is people took a lot of pride in their neighborhood schools, and all of a sudden this program was taking kids and shipping them an hour away just to satisfy some quota. So there were protests all over the country when it came to busing. It was people hated it, but the fact was these schools had to be integrated somehow. So during the 70s and early 80s, busing was very common and still very hated. One of the most famous protests was sort of a long-term, like decade-long protest of busing in Boston. What happened there was in 1974, a judge ruled that white students from a prominently Irish neighborhood had to be bused into a black part of town and go to school there. And this caused sort of violent riots on both sides. This famous photo was at one of those riots where this black student was attacked by this white crowd. Actually, the next day, in response to this famous incident, a group of black teenagers threw rocks at a white man's car, causing him to crash, and the crowd cheered, "Let him die, let him die," and that guy actually died. There were dozens of other incidents throughout Boston throughout the years, but this busing program kept happening because they had to integrate the schools somehow. The overall result of this busing program, which eventually ended in the 80s, late 80s, was predominantly white flight, where white people either left town, went to the suburbs where they wouldn't be affected by this, or in the white schools at least, they had a small portion of black students bussed in, as opposed to them being the ones that had to be bussed into black schools. Or they stayed in the city, but they sent their kids to private schools. What Boston actually found during this time, during these 10 or so years, was their enrollment in their public schools went from about 100,000 down to about 50,000, and almost all those students that left were the white students. So even today, these statistics kind of still reflect that, where Boston's about 55% white, but its population in schools is only about 15% white. And that drastic change took place as a result of this busing program. We saw the same kind of results all over the country, but Boston was kind of the forefront of the busing protest movement. The other solution to integrating schools was magnet schools. So as the school busing program started to wrap up in the 80s, much to the happiness of almost everyone, because the busing programs were very much hated, the next strategy to integrate schools became magnet schools. I'm going to briefly define magnet schools here, and then I'll go into more detail shortly. Magnet schools are basically schools built using federal or state money in minority districts, but the schools are so great and have some appealing quality that they're going to attract white students from the surrounding areas to them. And that attraction is why they're called magnet schools. It's almost like the school is a magnet attracting these white students to them. Magnet schools have always been very well liked by the public because they offer consumer choice, which is the exact opposite of what the busing programs were. Before I go more into the magnet schools, I wanted to bring up Sheff v. O'Neill from 1996. This was a Connecticut-based court decision. Basically, in 1989, Milo Sheff's parents, that's a photo of, these are both photos of Milo Sheff. On the left was in 89 when his parents first filed the lawsuit. He was a student in Hartford whose parents said that he wasn't receiving a fair education because his school was, overwhelmingly minority. And the suit initially lost in court. Basically, the judge said, it's not our fault that the districts are drawn the way they are. This case went to the Supreme Court in 1996, and the Supreme Court ruled that the way the districts were set up were in fact unconstitutional, and the state had to find certain ways to provide a more fair education to minority students. As I mentioned before, busing programs was basically out of the question because they were so hated. So what Connecticut has been doing in recent years is implementing a lot more magnet schools and charter schools, which I'll explain more about now. So let's talk a little more about magnet schools. You see, private schools are doing their own thing, and here is the realm of public schools. See, I have charter schools kind of half in, half out on public schools. It's because charter schools receive their funding as if they were public schools, so they get funding from the city they're in, but they have a lot of autonomy in terms of the decisions they can make, whom they can hire, school hours, that sort of thing. Magnet schools I have entirely within the public school realm. That's because magnet schools are public schools. The staff works for the city. They don't work just for the school. They have a lot less leeway in terms of diverging from the city's school hours and school holidays, that sort of thing. And I guess in this model you can kind of imagine the rest of this is your average neighborhood schools. So let's go over some ways that magnet schools differ from other public schools. First idea is a theme. Nearly every magnet school has a theme, and kind of the purpose of that theme is to be the main selling point of the school, because the idea behind a magnet school is you want to attract students. Common themes include STEM, performing arts. In Bridgeport, where we are going to be visiting, some of the themes of magnet schools include STEM, like I mentioned. We're going to be visiting Discovery Elementary Magnet School. That has a STEM theme. The high school we're going to visit is called Fairchild Wheeler, and that's a magnet school. They actually have 4 themes. In that school, there are 4 different schools, so when you attend the school, you kind of choose which school you want to pursue. The themes there are zoology, aerospace, IT, and military academy. There's an aquaculture theme magnet school in Bridgeport. That one actually is unique in that students will go to Aqua for part of the day and then go back to their regular school for another part of the day. There is a theme of multicultural. There's a multicultural magnet school in Bridgeport, and the theme there is, kind of celebrating diversity. There's a theme of literacy in one of the magnet schools. Basically, this theme acts almost like the theoretical framework in our Tuesday class, in that it's like the lens through which everything else is taught. So even when you're in a STEM school, like at Discovery, where we're gonna go, they still teach, the they teach every subject there. You have art classes. It's just everything kind of has a little bit of a touch of STEM to it. Same thing in the performing arts magnet schools. They still teach science and math, but there's always a little hint of the theme. Another characteristic of magnet schools is that they draw students from multiple districts. That's where the term magnet school comes from, because the school is like a magnet that attracts students. And these schools generally receive additional funds. Initially, their funding usually comes from either a state grant or a federal grant, and those grants usually include operating costs for a number of years. So not only do these schools usually not cost their district money, but they actually receive more money per student than your average neighborhood school. That's, again, part of this whole idea of drawing students from multiple districts. If you're in Bridgeport and you're a magnet school, you need to be appealing enough to get that, rich kid from Fairfield, to get his parents to send you to that school, as opposed to going to, a great high school in that area. Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of magnet schools. First pro is racial desegregation. Magnet schools have been very successful at mixing students from the home district and from the surrounding districts. Academic achievement. We've seen that magnet schools in this state and in other states are some of the highest achieving schools in terms of test scores and graduation rates. One of the kind of flagship magnet schools in Connecticut is Capital Prep Magnet School up in Hartford. That's one of those year-round schools, and it has a 0% dropout rate and 100% graduation rate. 100% of their students go to four-year colleges. Finally, magnet schools offer parent choice and school competition. Basically, instead of force busing, it just gives parents more of a decision in where to send their students, and school competition comes into play because the neighborhood schools don't want to lose all their best and most motivated students to the magnet schools, so they're going to try to do better too. Let's talk about some of the cons of magnet schools. Drawing top students from neighborhood schools is certainly one of the arguments against magnet schools. The type of student that's going to want to go to a high school that has an interesting theme like STEM or aquaculture or something like that, or your top creative students that'll go to a performing arts school, those are the ones that you would want to keep if you were a neighborhood school. Some magnet schools have selective admissions processes, which again contributes to this top point. Most magnet schools don't have any sort of test you need to take to get in. Most of them, if you want to get in, all you need to do is have your parents fill out an application by a certain deadline, and then you get put on a list, and in almost every case that list fills up immediately and everyone else goes on a waiting list. Or I shouldn't say, it's not first come first serve. Anyone that wants to apply can apply, and then it's chosen by a lottery. But if you think about it, just to make that first step of looking up how to apply and going to the school or downloading and printing the papers to apply and getting papers in by the deadline, that kind of initiative will separate certain parents from other parents. If you have a deadbeat parent that's going to have no interest in his or her child's education, they're not going to go through those steps. Now, certain magnet schools will have a selective admissions process, meaning you have to take a test, and they'll incorporate test scores into who gets in, and that one would certainly pull the top students from neighborhood schools, and even like any of the performing arts schools, you usually need to submit, a portfolio or do a quick, audition to get into those, and you're pulling the creative students out of those schools. And finally, one of the cons can be resources. Now, the resources generally don't come from the city. For example, Bridgeport is not paying to have these magnet schools here, which is great for Bridgeport, but Connecticut's spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these magnet schools, and that money could be reinvested into your neighborhood schools to make those better. So that's just another argument people make against magnet schools. Let's talk a little bit about Connecticut specifically for magnet schools. We have 54 magnet schools, almost 23,000 students. Most of the magnet schools are in Bridgeport and Hartford. 71% of the students in magnet schools are minority, and the state average for minority students is 38%. And the student-teacher ratio is equal to the state average of 13 to 1. The basic plan for Tuesday, I'll tell you where we're going to be visiting, and I'll go over the homework. So the first place we're going to visit is Fairchild Wheeler. Fairchild Wheeler Magnet School. So this is a high school. This is kind of where my internship is based out of, so I know a little bit more about this school than the other schools. It's a very new school. The building's in its first year. It was funded by a federal grant by Congressman Himes. The grant was for $116 million, which is quite a lot for a high school. So the building itself is beautiful, fully stocked. But you'll kind of see when we speak to some of the teachers that not everything works perfectly. They're still working out some of the bugs. The school has 4 themes. So when students come, they kind of choose which school they would like to go to. There's a zoology school, the aerospace school, the IT school, and the military academy. Right now, there's only 9th and 10th graders, since it's just the first year, but next year it'll be 9, 10, and 11th, and then after that it'll be all 4 years. The quota for students is 70% of local Bridgeport students and 30% from the surrounding areas, those being Easton, Fairfield, Monroe, Milford, Reading, Shelton, Stratford, and Trumbull. So basically it's going to be 70% minority students from Bridgeport and 30% generally white students from the surrounding areas. Fairchild Wheeler, one of their big selling points is they're utilizing relationships with kind of resources around the area. They work closely with the like universities, Sacred Heart, Bridgeport University, Fairfield University. They're working with Sikorsky Aircraft, which is based out of Stratford. They make helicopters. They work with Beardsley Zoo. They work with, what's the last one called? The Discovery Museum nearby. So yeah, from what I could tell, it's a great school. It's beautiful, but they're still working out some of the kinks. The plan for Tuesday is to meet up here, speak with some teachers, science teachers, math teachers, and then we'll get a tour of the school led by the science director of Bridgeport, who is kind of my the mentor for my internship. And then we're going to leave Fairchild Wheeler after about an hour, hour and a half. We're going to go to Discovery Magnet School. The theme here is STEM. So we go to our mission. This is actually at the museum, but the school is basically tied into the museum. So it's to engage, excite, and educate visitors in the exploration of science, technology, and ideas through interactive experiences that promote new ideas. So we go to actually the school's website here, Interdistrict Discovery Magnet. You can see like the principal's message here. Welcome to Interdistrict Magnet, Discovery Magnet School family as we embark on our journey to create an exemplary STEM school. So, let me just get right to the homework. Okay. What I want you to do, spend a few minutes on the websites of Discovery Magnet School and Fairchild Wheeler Magnet School. Look around, look at the photos, look at some of the programs. I want you to develop 3 questions you'd ask to a teacher or administrator at these schools. Remember, we are speaking with some teachers at Fairchild Wheeler. We're speaking with my internship advisor, who is the director of science for Bridgeport, so that's certainly an administrator role. And at Discovery, we're speaking with the principal there. I guess I didn't explain that. At Discovery, like the entire school is going on a field trip that day, except for the principal. So we're going to meet with the principal, get a quick tour of the school, and we'll kind of be able to speak with her about these sort of questions. So by Sunday, if you could send these to me, and then I'll have some more details that I'll get in touch with you guys over the weekend. And third thing, optional, arrange carpools if you can. It's a long drive, you know. And parking's not really limited. The visitor parking at Fairchild Wheeler is kind of limited, so if everyone brings their own car, some of you are probably going to have to park really far away. Parking is very limited at Discovery, so I'm thinking, you know, we'll try to cram as many of us into our cars as possible when we go from Fairchild Wheeler to Discovery. So once again, here's your homework. By Sunday night, have those questions for me, and I'll get you guys more details when I can.